Welcome to the Potential Leader Lab, and I'm your host, Perry Moffmer. And today, on episode 49 in season 2, we are exploring the echoes in the dark, processing our inner voice for leadership. We don't just talk about leadership, we explore, experiment, and hopefully evolve our thinking and our actions. Now, this isn't your typical leadership podcast. First of all, we define leadership kind of broadly as taking actions to create a better world for those we care deeply about. So this would mean that we not only believe leadership is not reserved for those with titles or authority, but we also believe that every single person has both the capacity and, I would argue, the responsibility to lead each and every day from wherever we are. It's about action, influence, and owning the moments when leadership is required. And we are all about evolution, figuring out what it really takes to unlock the leader within you, because the world needs you and it needs what you have to offer. Now, this lab is for the relentless few willing to explore edges, experiment with boundaries, and evolve through perseverance, transforming the world in their wake. We believe leadership is not something you become, it's something you do. And here in the lab, we're going to explore and experiment with just how to do that. So if you're ready to unlock the potential you already have and embrace leadership as a moment-to-moment choice, then let's start exploring. And today we're going to explore something very near and dear to my heart. It's called Echoes in the Dark, Processing Our Inner Voice for Leadership. All right, so today we're going to talk about something I spend a lot of time talking about with folks. I spend a lot of time thinking about myself, which is what we'll call head trash, that persistent, most often negative narrative we have in our minds. Now, in order to do this, I am going to do this. I find most of my inspiration for thought comes mostly from literature and music. And so when I find a particularly interesting lyric, I'll listen to the song over and over again and just think about the implications for me. And so what we're actually going to start with is I'm going to read you three stanzas of three verses of a song by a group called Sons of Bill. And the song is called Hymn Song. And so just listen to the lyrics as I read them. And then we're going to kind of break down some of the very particular pieces of those. And I'm going to share with you what I think it means in context of how we struggle with some of these things as leaders. So here are the three verses of the song. All the years I lost to sadness, all the years I lost to rage. Like a dog that bites its master, have you rattled at your cage. All the words you left unspoken gather round your brain to grieve, around the slowly fading picture of the man you couldn't be. When we reach our proper station, will we have to shield our eyes from the background radiation underneath these silent skies, or live as dust beneath the altar, so forgotten and discreet, with no chance to ever falter underneath your Savior's feet? We're convinced that there's a cadence to the murmurs in the dark, wrapped in patient arbitration between our weary head and heart, until our spirits cease their raging in the silence of the night. We will look for love and logic in the dying of the light. So again, that's Hymn Song, all one word, by Sons of Bill. So I want to start off with the very first line. All the years I've lost to sadness, all the years I've lost to rage. Kind of as an example of wasted time consumed by unaddressed emotions. I think there's two quotes I'll give you. One's anonymous and one's from Sigmund Freud. Freud said, "Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways." And a more contemporary way to say that would be this one, which is anonymous. If you don't heal what hurt you, you bleed on people who didn't cut you. And so I know from the last 10 years and from my own experience, the last 10 years talking to leaders and the 25 years before that being in leadership roles, unresolved emotions are a real thing and can actually lead to ineffective decision making and things like poor relationship management. And I think it's important because we have to get down to the root of why we don't want to talk about emotions, why they are in fact unresolved. And that's usually because of our need to avoid them in business, in the workplace, and really not just there, everywhere. we tend to not want to talk about emotions. We don't want to talk about things that are quote unquote emotional. Why? Why do we avoid that? And I think if we dig down, it becomes very simply we don't want to appear weak or vulnerable, right? We have this misconception that talking about emotions, that feeling emotions, that oh, God forbid we actually act emotionally and share those emotions. I can tell you when I first heard this song, I know where I was, right? I remember where I was. I was actually in Springfield, Ohio. I was driving over with Lisa, and I was helping her with something, and I was sitting. She had gone in to actually talk to somebody in one of the. We had drove separately because we were doing a show, and she was inside talking to the folks at the show, and I was sitting in my car, with tears running down my face. And I listened to this song like 4 or 5 times in a row. And I think it's interesting because when we think about being vulnerable, we think about being weak. We connect those 2 things for some way, vulnerability and weakness, which, by the way, I'm just gonna share this with you from Brené Brown. Vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never weakness. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. Now, I want you to think about those words. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. And it's the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. I don't know about you, but I hear lots of business leaders asking for those things in their workplace: accountability, authenticity, empathy, courage, creativity, hope. Those are all things that everybody wants. Well, we just figured out that the birthplace and the source of them are vulnerability. So what the hell are we doing here? And and this isn't about just letting it out. This isn't about just going around telling everybody how you feel. This starts with self-awareness, right? Self-awareness of how do you feel, because that will impact what you think and how you act. And if we don't have the emotional granularity to understand that, we got a problem. And the research will tell you that self-awareness leads to things like understanding your own strengths and weaknesses. In companies, it can lead to better financial performance, improved decision making, leadership maturity, building stronger relationships, establishing healthy boundaries, and more effective communication. Now, how are those things not relevant to what we do every day? They're very relevant. And that means we have to work on being emotionally regulated. We have to be able to regulate our emotions. And that's simply the ability to manage and respond emotional experiences in a healthy and constructive way. And not only if we do this, do we show other people how to do it, but we can leverage emotions as fuel and something positive, regardless of if they're what we would determine good or bad emotions, because I don't think there are good or bad. They're just emotions. They're good or bad on how we process them. Now, how do we do that? Well, we have to have some self-reflection, mindfulness practice, feedback from trusted colleagues. I mean, a daily practice of just checking your own emotional state. Ask yourself a couple questions. What am I feeling, and why am I feeling this way? I mean, if you want to think about self-awareness, start there. What am I feeling? Number one, and get granular. Don't just use one word. Use 2 or 3. If you need a list, you can look it up. You can find a list of emotions. It's very interesting, actually, if you would do that. If you keep that list around, and when you feel an emotion, the next time you feel one, stop and ask yourself, I'm going to pick 3 to 5 of these to describe it. It will be very eye-opening for you as to what you're truly feeling. And then, why am I feeling this way? Because that will affect how you behave in your decision making. And this awareness gives you space, which is what you desperately need to regulate your emotions before they manifest themselves negatively. Right? You need space. You can I'll tell you what, the best way to do this is pause. Pause. Because here's the thing I want to tell you, being decisive isn't about time, right? It isn't quickness. It isn't urgent. It isn't doing it immediately. That's not what decisive is, but that's what we've confused it with. We've confused it with speed. And so if you want to, I know that most people want to be perceived as decisive, but decisive people think, they commit. And so having that pause built in, and when we talk about a pause, I'm not talking about an hour. I'm talking seconds and minutes. I mean, give yourself 90 seconds. Why wouldn't you? If it's something meaningful, why wouldn't you want to think about it? Because if you're in a back and forth conversation with somebody and you're just playing ping pong by knocking that thing back and forth, you're not thinking, you're reacting. And by the way, you're not listening because if I'm listening to the other person, I can't formulate what I'm going to say that has any meaning. I'm preloading my response regardless of what they say. So just chew on that one for a minute. But I would implement a pause strategy. Count to 10, count to 15, step away and think. I've had this time and time again. I'll be in a one-to-one with somebody and they'll be talking for, a minute, 2 minutes, and they're explaining something to me and they stop talking. And then I'm just kind of sitting there looking at them and they go, well, and I said, well, I'm thinking, give me a minute. I'm processing everything you just shared. It was a lot. I don't have a response like keyed up. I got to think about it. I want my response to be something meaningful. Another way is, I know people don't want to hear this, but it's develop empathy for the other person. That's really what allows us to understand the emotions of other people and then turn that insight into our emotional responses. But we have to understand, we have to be willing to understand. I read a great quote the other day about sympathy and empathy because oftentimes people want to know what's the difference. And for me, I'm not going to go through the quote. It's a pretty long quote, but essentially the interesting part of it was sympathy is you have sympathy from a position of power, which I thought was fascinating. And empathy is when you realize when you get down and you look at that person eye to eye, that could be you if it weren't for luck. And I think that gives some pause to people to understand that, empathy is about understanding that person's scenario and that you could just have easily has been in it. You could just have easily been in it if it weren't for some luck. I'm not taking away hard work and all that bullshit we tell ourselves, but I am telling you there's an element of luck in all of it. So ask yourself again, back to questions, right? The best way to help other people is to ask questions. The best way to help yourself is to ask questions as well. Ask yourself this one: what might that other person be feeling right now? What might be contributing to their actions? Because your mind, your brain has already made up a story that is not to either of your favors. You've already got an answer and you've taken action based on the incorrect, um, infactual fairy tale that your brain's made up about why they did what they did. And if you take a pause and you ask yourself, what might the other person be feeling and what has led them to this? And you entertain some other options than the one you immediately think, you might get a much broader view of the situation and therefore a much different response from the other person that could be much more favorable than you would have anticipated. So, next line we want to look at. Like a dog that bites its master, have you rattled against your cage? Now, to me, that speaks to self doubt and fear of failure. Self imposed limits, however we think about ourselves. I mean, I just love the line, right? Like a dog that bites its master, have you rattled at your cage? I spent years rattling at my cage of my own creation, but a cage nonetheless. And so, how do we get out of that? Well, there's a couple ideas. And by the way, I know that, and it's interesting because there is no easy way to do this. I mean, I'm not telling you anything. You're like, oh my God, I've never heard of that before. We've heard of all of these. We just won't do them. I mean, just do one of these things, right? Just try one of them, but it takes a different behavior. If you want things to be different, you have to do different. That's the formula. I don't want to oversimplify it, but that's pretty much it. If you want things to be different, you have to do different. And it's always amazes me that people that go see, coaches or even when you go to therapists. I mean, I've seen a therapist and they give you tools. Well, you have to use the tools. Like, it's not going to fix itself. You don't go to somebody and talk for an hour 5 times in over a month and then suddenly you're different. It takes hard work. You have to change your behavior, which, by the way, is not a light switch. It'll be starts and stops and ups and downs and 2 step forwards and 6 steps back. That's why relentless is so key to this, right? Because you have to be oppressively constant with your effort. So, digress a little bit. Back to the ideas or tools here. A cognitive reappraisal through journaling. Right? Set aside, again, not a ton of time. I'm not saying take an hour. Take 5, 7 minutes, and then write about what you're thinking. What are those self-limiting beliefs or situations that you experienced today where you felt inadequate? And then ask yourself, I love cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's based on, is this thought based on fact or fear? Do I have any objective data points to back up what I'm concerned with, the bad thoughts that are running through my mind? Do I have any objective history or data that supports that actually happening? And oftentimes, I'm not saying never, but oftentimes when you do that, you actually find contradictory evidence to the positive, and then you dismiss it somehow. But write it down. I cannot tell you the power that comes from writing your thoughts down, because thinking things and writing things down give you way different perspectives. Because once you write them down, if you actually wrote down your self-limiting beliefs, you would see how asinine they were. You would actually laugh. I dare you. Write them down and show them to somebody who knows you and say, this is what I believe about myself, and see what the response is from the other person. But we don't want to do that because we like it. We want to believe it. So another idea is it's called temporal distancing. You can shortcut it and call it the 10-year reflection. When you're thinking about something that's going on, right? Think long term. Thinking about the future changes the present, and ask yourself, how would I view the situation 10 years from now? Will it still matter? Because oftentimes we just let whatever's in front of us blow up to be everything because we don't have a long view. We're not thinking about what we want most. We're thinking about this is right now. Now, another really cool question after that is, how will my future self have overcome this? I mean, think about that. Think about who you're going to become, who you're going to evolve into, and how would that person address this situation? How would the person you're striving to become act now? Be that person now. You don't need anything else to be that person. You're choosing different behaviors. And then the last one I'll give you is just mindfulness-based stress reduction, right? So this is just mindfulness. And this is understanding that you're going to have thoughts. You're going to have negative and self-limiting thoughts. They're not you. Your thoughts are not you. You are not your thoughts. So you can have those thoughts, and the goal here is to have them and then let them go. They're just thoughts. They're not you. They're not real. They're not true. They're not facts. They're only facts if you believe them. You're going to have self-limiting thoughts. That's okay. Oftentimes it's beneficial. It's telling you what to watch out for. But you have to be able to let that go. Think of them as balloons. They kind of float in and they float out. Don't grab a hold of them and anchor yourself. All right, on to the next one. All the words you left unspoken of the man you couldn't be. So, closing the loop on unfinished business. What do we do about it? Adopt a learning, not regret mindset. right? We can reframe past decisions as learning experiences. We cannot change the past, but we can change what the past means. We cannot change the past, but we can change what the past means. And that significantly reduces the feelings of regret because we can look back and say, what did we learn? And here's the thing, most of our, I guess we could call them failures, most of our significant failures in life are where we learn the most. That's where those were what they call crucible moments in our life, where we were formed, right? A crucible is an environment where something is formed out of destruction. But we learn. Whenever we're in the middle of it, you know what they say, if you're going through hell, just don't quit. Don't quit, keep moving. There's only one way there's only one way out, and that's through. So we have to be aware that this too shall pass. No, and usually, and you can go back to cognitive behavioral therapy, every time in the past, did it suck? Absolutely. Did it feel good? Absolutely not. But did the sun come up tomorrow and was the earth still spinning on its axis? Yes. And as I think it was, I forget who said it. I think it was Robert Frost who said, the one thing that I have learned about life is summed up in 3 words: it goes on. And it does. But if you're going to adopt that learning, not regret mindset, then take time to reflect. Reflect on what worked, what didn't, and what you learned every time. If you do that all the time with things that work out, good or bad, if you do it all the time, you normalize the discussion with yourself. If you just do a debrief after everything, what worked out well, what would I do better? What went well, what didn't, what would I do better? Those 3 questions. Just start there. And I think that there's 2 more things to do about closing the loop, and one is practice a proactive decision making. Now, what you need for that, before you can practice proactive decision making, is have a thoughtful approach and have a framework. You have to have something, a framework that you're working on for it to be proactive. That way you can reflect back on, you can improvise on it. You can change a process or a framework if you have one. If you have none, it's hard to go back and learn from it. Because when you have a decision matrix or you have a framework, kind of like explore, experiment, evolve, the choices are always going to be well informed and deliberate because you have a process. And the final one, which I really love, is resolve unfinished business through open conversations. That is, after something happens, don't just try to resolve it for yourself, resolve it for everybody that's around you. Reach out and initiate these kind of open, candid discussions around the issue. Let everybody close the loop. Let everybody talk about what went well, what didn't go well, what would we do differently. Are these going to be, I would argue they are going to be fun conversations, but they'll also be challenging conversations. But think about being able to completely discuss something that happened and then move on after that. Everybody moves on. Everybody has the opportunity to share how they feel and what they thought. But we don't do that because of our sense of urgency. We got to move to the next thing. Oh, it's all about the next thing. Move on. And quite honestly, we don't like talking about failure. So especially when something doesn't go right, we tend to move on pretty quickly. All right, the next piece I want to talk about is when he talks about when we reach our proper station. And I think that speaks to continually realigning our identity and our purpose. And I think that means that we, as somebody who wants to lead, are constantly reflecting on who we are versus who we want to become to be. Who we want to become, I'm sorry. Who we want to be, who we want to become. And I think that's really going to be connected to the people that are involved, the people that we care deeply about, and who do we have to become or be for them, for us, for all of us? Where does self-actualization overlap with self-transcendence? How do I become the best version of myself in service to other people? And leadership is not about reaching a fixed destination. It always involves continuous evolution and self-discovery, reevaluating, and adapting along the way, which is essentially the definition of evolution. It's not about achieving a goal, it's who you become along the way of achieving that goal. that matters. And I think David Hawkins said it very eloquently when he said, "We change the world not by what we say or do, but as a consequence of what we become." We change the world not by what we say or do, but as a consequence of what we become. And that's the difference between a true calling versus external validation. We have to have that measurement of how we're going to evaluate what we're doing that does not rely on external validation. Because only we can say if we're aligned with our deeper mission. But reflect on that, what that term proper station looks like. Consider the path that you're on now and your core values and your purpose. For my version of this, I ask people, what do you want most? What I want most versus what I want now. And if we always have what we want most right out in front of us, we'll make decisions that better support what we believe in. Not all the time, but we'll never wake up panicked and wonder how we got here. Because we only do that when we don't have clarity around what I want most or what you want most or what we want most. When there is no clarity around that, the world will tell you nature hates a vacuum. So if you don't select it, it will be selected for you. All right, moving on. We're convinced that there's a cadence to the murmurs in the dark. It's difficult dealing with ambiguity, uncertainty. We tend to avoid it. We don't like it. So, a couple things to think about. Obviously, one that we've referenced many times in many discussions is the growth mindset by Carol Dweck. Look at adversity as an opportunity. In a growth mindset, failure is an inevitability. We seek failure because that's the point of opportunity. That's where we get to learn. So we chase it. We want it because then we can go, oh, there it is. There's my chance. There's my chance to grow. Because if I never find it, a lot of people say they have a growth mindset, but they surely don't act like it because they don't want to fail. Just think about when you get to that scenario, when something does go wrong, think about the question. Again, back to asking yourself some questions. What can I learn? And how can this challenge me to grow as a leader? How does this situation challenge me to grow as a leader? Those are great questions and they're great ways to look at adversity. Another way is benefit finding, or you can call technically you could call it positive reappraisal. And that is simply saying that things don't happen to you, they happen for you. So in any situation, it's like, why did this happen to me? Why did this have to happen to me? And think to yourself, well, how did this happen for me? What does it enable me to do? What are the hidden benefits of this experience? If I dig in and I can see behind it, what's the benefit to me and the people that I care about? How do I make this mean something? Nietzsche said, suffering is what we do in life, and our goal is to have that suffering have meaning, to make that suffering have meaning, which is essentially what we're doing with this. I'm not trying to minimize the situation. I'm not saying it's a great situation, but what greatness can I take out of it? And then finally, with that, connect to your larger purpose. Go back to what you want most. If you view all of these things you're going through as challenges and part of your greater journey, whether it's serving your team, organization, community, whatever you're doing, you'll find meaning in it. It's like Odysseus, where the word Odyssey comes from. When Odysseus took his 10-year journey home, he faced numerous number of challenges, but none of those mattered because he was still trying to get home. So he was going to overcome them. He was going over, around, through, below, under. It didn't matter. He was getting through the challenges because he wanted to get home. Well, what are you trying to get to? Because that way it turns the mountain into a molehill. Because if I'm looking way off in the future in the distance to the thing I want, then if I have that view way, way ahead, then whatever's in front of me looks this big because the thing I want is this big. But if I don't have this, this becomes this. And I'm doing little hand motions if you're not watching on YouTube, I'm making the molehill and the mountain reference, right? So if you have nothing beyond today, then whatever happens today is the mountain you can't see around. If you have a mountain clearly in view that's way off in the distance, then anything right now looks like a molehill. Next verse. wrapped in patient arbitration between our weary head and heart. Just remember, the longest journey you'll ever take is 18 inches from your head to your heart. We struggle with reconciling what we'll call logical decision making and emotional integrity. And this is not an either or, it's a both and. Great leaders understand both components. Now, I know everybody loves to talk about this next opportunity for this particular thing, which is collaboration, collaborative problem solving. That's one way to incorporate both your head and your heart because you're not in it by yourself, you're not in it alone, and you are tapping other people in your team, in your group, in your inner circle to offer their thoughts and feelings about the issue, ones that you can't access because it's not you. That's what the value of a team is. You need all of those perspectives, but in order to listen, you have to have empathy. You have to understand that other people aren't going to agree with you, and you have to be able to take all of those disparate pieces of feedback, all those thoughts and emotions, and consider all of them. And then figure out what are the important parts that you need to process in order to make the very best decision you can. Because if you're faced with a complex problem, you need different perspectives, and you need to encourage both analytical and emotional approaches. You want to hear it all. That's what wise people do. The other thing you can do in this scenario is value-based leadership. Most companies have worked really hard to develop values. They just seem to forget about them after they wrote them on the wall. The real value is using them during decision making. And what I tell folks is I like to have, again, back to guardrails, right? I like to have guardrail on one side that is our financial formula. How do we make money? What are our expectations financially? And on the other side, we have mission, vision, values. So when we're making decisions, we just have to satisfy both of those. And if we can satisfy both of them, it's a no-brainer. It's quick, man. We can move. Now, if we're only going to satisfy one of them, probably need to have a conversation. And if we're going to satisfy neither, we can move quickly too and just not do it. So the only time we get kind of slowed down is if something matches our mission, vision, values, but it isn't satisfying us financially or vice versa. We still may decide to do it, but we're going to have a larger, slower, more inclusive conversation. All right. So last piece before we wrap this thing up. So until our spirits cease their raging in the silence of the night. Now, to me, this speaks to how leaders often battle with restlessness and self-doubt. And by the way, that can undermine your confidence and clarity. And I think these raging spirits, we need to quiet them through mindfulness and self-compassion that creates a more peaceful internal environment for us. And just think, and this is where some leaders struggle, right? Not only do they struggle with compassion for others, they struggle with compassion for themselves. And Jack Kornfield said, if your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete. So it's really hard to offer to other people what you don't offer to yourself with any kind of authenticity and integrity. So self-compassion, developed by psychologist Kristen Neff, involves treating yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer to anybody else. So, practicing self-compassion helps you reduce negative self-talk and fosters resilience against that self-doubt. But you have to practice it on a regular basis. I mean, the best way, I know we never get rid of the voice in our head. It's necessary. It's evolutionary. It's evolutionary. We need it, but we don't have to listen to it all the time. We have to be able to treat it as we should in order to move ourselves forward. But here's what we can do when you have that initial response of you should do this or you should do that or this is what you're doing or you're good, bad, or whatever. Think about if you had a close personal friend, someone you cared deeply about, was experiencing the same situation that you were. What would you tell them? Would you tell them what the voice in your head is telling you? Worse yet, would you act on what your voice in your head is telling you about yourself? That kind of harsh self-criticism. Is that what you tell other people? Because if you wouldn't tell them, you shouldn't tell yourself. The other way to silence kind of the, cease the cease the get our spirits to cease their raging in the silence of the night is the gap in the gain. by Dan Sullivan and Ben Hardy, right? The gap is when leaders focus on the distance between current state and ideal state, and this contains feelings of frustration, self doubt, inadequacy, and it emphasizes what hasn't been accomplished. By the way, which undermines motivation and self confidence if we just keep chasing the horizon. If you think about that, if all we're doing is saying, "Hey," and I hear this all the time, leaders will tell people in their organization, "Hey, you did a great job," and then they follow it with, "But we have a lot farther to go." And I tell them, just say the first thing and shut up. You did a great job. Full stop. But we have this fear, this kind of unrealistic fear that if we tell somebody they've done a good job, they'll stop. I don't know where we get that, but we think if I tell them they're good, they won't work as hard, which, by the way, has never been proven in any kind of measurable way by science. And then, as opposed to the gap, if we live in the gain, it focuses on how far we've come from the starting point to where we are now, not on how far we've yet to go. And this, as you can imagine, and I've had this conversation a couple times in the last week with folks about the last year. They've actually said, "Wow, when we started doing X, I never imagined we'd be as far as we are now." When they sit back and look at it objectively. And if you focus people leaders who focus on the gains, you recognize incremental improvements and it fosters a sense of accomplishment, it builds confidence, and by the way, it reduces self-doubt for your team and for you. And if you regularly focus on the gain, you develop a more positive forward-looking mindset that actually supports resilience and continuous improvement because you're building on what you've already done. And it aligns perfectly with psychological benefits of celebrating small wins as both focus on recognizing and valuing progress. So it isn't that you're saying we can slow down, we've got there, we've arrived, we've won. It simply says we are moving in the right direction. Let's keep going. Nobody's going to stop. Nobody's going to slow down as much as that irrational fear exists for everybody. So, sum it all up, leadership is not about silencing the inner voice, but understanding it, transforming it from a critic to an ally. Because we're all going to have head trash. We all have we all have to confront internal conflicts, and we have to strive for alignment between our head and our heart. We have to take that 18-inch journey that takes a lifetime. And that's okay, right? We're not trying to get rid of any of this. We're trying to make it work for us. So, the last two things that I'll give you, the last two kind of thoughts, as I want to reiterate, just fostering that culture of collaboration. Leadership is a team sport. You are not in this alone, nor can you do it effectively alone. Isolation is never good. And by the way, when you create these opportunities for your team, you're encouraging them to grow. But you have to give up some of that power, right? You have to give up some of that to other people and pull them in and create space for them. They're not going to fight you for it. And then the last thing I will tell you, again, back to asking questions, because we all have self doubt. When you have it, turn it into curiosity. Ask, what's my inner critic trying to protect me from? That's a really cool question because we're all about self preservation and safety. And if your brain is telling you some negative things about whatever's going on, more than likely, if you dig into it, it's trying to protect you from something. Answer those questions. What is my inner critic trying to protect me from? And then the other question could be, what can I learn from this doubt? And this turns the critic into a source of insight and growth by treating it as a signal for exploration rather than a threat. So again, reframe it. What's it trying to protect me from? What can I learn from? Don't try to don't try to change the narrative. Don't try to make it be something else. Just reframe what it means. All right. So that was that. That we talked about hymn song from Sons of Bill, and I hope it's helpful. And that's about it for today's exploration. So now it's up to you to create your own experiments on your way to your own personal evolution. And I'd like you to remember that leadership is not something that happens to you, it's something you step into. You already have the tools, the influence, and the potential. The only thing left is for you to recognize the moment when leadership is needed and decide if you will act. So, what's your next move? Where will you step up? Because leadership isn't about waiting for permission, it's about recognizing that you're already capable right now. The only question is, will you act? Do you have the will to act? Now, if you found today's session valuable, make sure you rate, subscribe, and share because leading is a team sport and you need to build your own community if you want your efforts to be sustainable. And another little interesting thing, it occurred to me after some conversations with folks that listen. If you are in a kind of leadership or managerial role and you have a team, you can go back to some old episodes. This is zero cost leadership development you're listening to because we're talking about practical steps to do things differently. So you might be amazed if you pull one episode out you like, have everybody listen to it, and then talk about it and find out what thoughts it stimulates in other people. So we hope you keep coming back for more on how to unlock the leader within you so you can join us in creating a better world for those we care deeply about. And until next time, remember, leadership is a verb. Go do it.